So the beginning of the book was very polemical. Whether it was satire or not, it's a good question. As we mentioned, maybe satire may just be the way of writing that he is, seeing the Hamburg Bezdin as taking down Judaism and sees them as, in that sense, not religious enough. But there's a lot of back and forth of writing of books against each other here. So here we transition into the halachic part, and he begins it. It's always important. Schneur Lyman pointed this out, and Professor Torsky, that the introductions to books, or even the front page of a book, is just as important in telling you the secrets of it as reading the book itself. And so it's interesting that when he transitions here, what does he start with? How does he introduce kind of the halachic part? So he says, Ner l'ragli divarecha, v'or l'nesibati va'ancha cherpi davar ki vatachti b'dvarecha. This is a common phrase, that God should lighten my way as I write, and I've trusted in your word. Then he says, Korei na'im asher yesh lecha einayim lirot. Dear reader, if you have eyes to see, v'lev lahavin alaskil, and a heart to understand, bein tavin et asher lefanecha, whether you understand what's before you, titzdak b'dvarecha, in order to be righteous in your words, tizker b'shvatecha, lemanti et Hashem b'ficha, v'shinantum levanecha, in order that the Torah should be in your mouth, you should teach it to your children. V'yadata ayom b'shevota, and you should know today, ki nachon hadavar me'im hu elokim, that the thing is good from God. Right, this is a phrase from Tanakh, ki nachon hadavar me'et Hashem. That's from
There's a pasuk ki karov elecha hadavar ma'od.
Right,
kind of close.
But I think this says something else. Oh, it's a Yosef. So that's interesting, right? The dream comes to Pharaoh twice, and Yosef is interpreting Pharaoh's dream. So he's using that phrase. Why? Now, maybe because he feels like Yosef going up against Pharaoh, is that the idea? In other words, I mean, in a way, like this has a sort of double entendre, right? Like on the one hand, he is small compared to the Hamburg Bezdin, perhaps in terms of his power also, but also, right, he's casting the Hamburg Bezdin as Paro and him as Yosef, right? That's this whole book, is like the question of who's in the right. For the Hamburg Bezdin, they represent traditions. So of course, they think they're in the right, but it's really not true. Like you could easily turn the tables, as he's kind of done, and say, you're preventing the tradition from continuing. We're not doing anything ex halachic here. And what we're doing to preserve the Jewish people. So he probably feels like he's waging, I assume that he doesn't have an ulterior motive. I mean, he's clearly a very big Talmid Chacham. He clearly feels that what he's doing is God's will. And that, this isn't, I mean, we know what the Reform movement, you fast forward 100 years, we know kind of where the Reform movement went. But this, this is 1820. They don't know, and it's when we think Reform, we think, pretty secular or pretty, that the Reformation was sort of radical. And it does become pretty radical pretty quickly in the 19th century. Certainly, wanting to do away with circumcision and Shabbos. I mean, those are the radical ends of the Reform movement. But but that emerges even in the 19th century. But at this point, I mean, it's not a reformation. It's people saying, we want to daven it's true. It's going to be called the temple. The beam is going to be in the front. The women are going to be on a balcony. And the main arguments in this book are around, and the halachic part centers on these two things. Basically, the real issues were prayer in a language you understand and the organ. That was it. And to us, those are the flags of reform, and we see that in a whole different 200-year context. But that's not how they saw it, right? I mean, they saw it as, here's a good idea. This is going to help davening. I mean, that's on some level how he saw it, So whether this is, it's definitely polemics, whether it was written as in a satirical form or not, that doesn't make it less serious. That's what I think is important to remember. And he's fighting a battle here. That's, I think, how we feel. I mean, I think we have to give him the credit, I don't think he's out to destroy the Jewish people here. He is, he's out in his own mind, he's out to save them. So is the Hamburg Bezdin. Who was right? I don't know. You can't judge 1820 by 2020. Had let's say that he had, I don't know who won out, but let's say that the Hamburg Bezdin had not gone against the reform. Would that have made the reform movement basically, orthodoxy with an organ and a and prayer in the language people understood? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it would have been. Maybe nothing would have changed. But it's you can't really know. I'm just saying we should put ourselves in their shoes and not necessarily judge them by 200 years of historical knowledge that we have that they're not privy to. There's a tendency, I think, to do that. So here he quotes Jeremiah. And it's a good question. Why does he quote Jeremiah here? See, I pulled up this pasuk. It's from 31st chapter of Yirmiyahu, of Jeremiah. Obviously, Jeremiah is the prophet of the destruction. Right, I'm going to make a covenant. Here Jeremiah says, and after the destruction, I'm going to make a covenant with the Jewish people, like I made with their fathers. Jeremiah talks about destruction, but he also talks about the rebuilding. Lo yilamdu od ishet reyehu, v'ishet achiv lemor du'u ki Hashem. And no longer will they need to teach one another and say to one another, heed God. For everybody, from the smallest to the greatest, will heed God. And then this is the pasuk that and then it's another pasuk. Ko amar Hashem nasim shemesh l'or yomam. So God says, I bring the sun for the light during the day. Now this may be, he quotes this pasuk, 36, but the fact that 35 is about light and darkness would fit into his polemics. Because remember, it was all about light and darkness. Stirs up the sea. And this is the pasuk he quotes. If these laws should ever be lost from before me, annulled from before me, says God, Gam zera Yisrael yishbesu miyadgai. So too, the seed of the Jewish people will cease to be a nation all the days, right? So Jeremiah is saying here that if the Torah is lost, if the Torah is lost, so too will the Jewish people be lost. Right, so that's what he's fighting over. What happens there? Click on the wrong thing. Here we go. right, if these chukim are, if the Torah is lost in the Jewish people will also be lost, right? That's the fight. It's not, he's not just like, we want to appeal to more people. This is a moment. I mean, it's fun. I think that's why we've been spending so much time in the 19th century, because it's such a moment of change and foment in a way that I don't think I ever realized till we started doing this. These are moments, these are crossroads in Jewish history where people are fighting tooth and nail for the Jewish people. I mean, you can see by quoting this, he's saying, we're not just, fighting over an organ, we're fighting over the continuity of the Jewish people. And then he goes into the halachic work. He says, and it'll be focused basically on first on prayer in another language and then in the organ. He quotes Mishnah Sota. Elu ne'amarin b'chal lashon. These are said in any language. Kriyat Shema, you can say Shema in any language. Tefillah, the Amidah, you can say in any language. Birkat Hamazon, you can say the grace after meals in any language. And then the Gemara comments on that. Kriyat Shema minol. And how do you know that you can read the Shema in any language? As it says, Shema Yisrael, listen Israel. How do you listen? You listen to what you know. In any language that you hear, that you can hear, that's fine for the Shema. Tefillah, how do we know prayer? Rachamehi, kol hechad boy matzli. Because prayer, the Amidah, is rachamim. You're beseeching God for mercy. So any way that you do that is going to be prayer. By definition, the Amidah can be done in any language. Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals, as it says, you should be satisfied and you shall bless. It doesn't say something about Hebrew. Bless, the Gemara says, any language that you bless in is fine. That's what he begins with. And then he's got a couple of footnotes here. And he quotes the Rav of Lisa. V'cholzo ta'iz panav cherev de Kehila Lisa. I think he's saying the rabbi of Lisa. There was two rabbis of Lisa, I think. One was sort of writing pro-reform, and one, I think, writes a letter in the Hamburg Bezdin's book. And he says it's Debo, which is Divrei Habrit, Ayin Tet. V'amar zal shmei tishmo aval tavinu lomer shishmu b'kabbalah af she'enu mevinim. Shimu shemoa, listen. V'al tavinu lomar, don't say shishmu b'kabbalah af she'enu mevinim. That people should just say what they've been told to say without understanding. Yaf b'kabbalat ha'achdut lo nemar habein Yisrael ela shma Yisrael. It says hero Israel. That's about receiving what the Torah you've gotten. Shimush Shamayim also. So he says that's what the rabbi of Lisa wrote in the book of the Hamburg Bezdin. And he says, Shimush Shamayim also. Listen to this. Hechi Karashmo Yaakov Vayakveni Zeh Pa'amayim. His first name was Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Lisa. And he says, he's called Jacob, he's fooled me twice. Shalosh b'peirushav, and 3 times in his commentary. Amnam piv haskilu. Ein anu rashayin lishtamish b'shum ofen b'shtosh sichleinu levad. I think what he's trying to say, we'd have to look back in Eli Divrei Habrit at what Rabbi Yaakov Lisa wrote. But it sounds like Rabbi Yaakov, he's going against Rabbi Yaakov Lisa, who was trying to make an argument that these things, that Shema had to be in Hebrew. We'll have to look back at that. We'll do that quickly. Let's see. See what I can find quickly. Let's see. Okay, said Daf Ayin Tet. It's just important to see. Now the footnotes, I don't know if he wrote or if somebody else wrote. It's a really long book, this Hamburg Benson book. Hamach Ayin. Tet. Here we go. All right, this is a letter of, okay, Michtav Meitagonim Mefursam. Here we go. Harav Agonim Mefursam L'Shavach. This is a letter of the great rabbi, the Av Bezdin of Lisa, Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa, Bala Machaber Nesivus HaMishpat. These are all the books that he wrote, and he writes to the Bezdin of Hamburg. Okay, he writes, it's quite a long letter, a few pages. And on page Ayin Tet, he writes, he's writing about the organ here. Okay, and then he says, changing the prayers, he says our Judaism is about faith, and we can't just go changing things. We can't just use our minds to change things. Oh, here we go. Having Israel, and even when it comes to Shema, it doesn't say understand Israel, it says listen Israel. So Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa is making an argument that you can't just take things into your own hands. You're not supposed to just use your intellect to figure out how Judaism should be. It doesn't say understand Israel, it says listen Israel. You just have to listen to what God says. Kabbalat hadvarim, you have to receive the things. Even the great rabbis and philosophers, they were led astray by Aristotle. Quotes King Solomon, he's arguing that you can't just take it into your own hands. But what he uses to make that argument is it doesn't say Shema, it doesn't say understand Israel, it says listen Israel. So he's arguing that what you have to do is just listen. So he takes that in the book that we're reading. He takes that here, and right, he's arguing from the Mishnah says you can say Shema in any language, and he says he quotes Rabbi Yaakov Lisa from that book. It doesn't say Haben Israel, understand Israel. It says listen Israel. But then he says, but then this Rabbi Breslau says, look what he's saying. He's quoting Shema, and he's using that as an argument that you just have to listen to God and not change anything by understanding it. But precisely that in the Gemara is the argument that you could say Shema in any language. The word Shema means, right? The Gemara says Shema b'chol lashon she'ata shomea. In any language you understand. In other words, he's trying to turn on his head exactly what Rabbi Yaakov Lisa said. Rabbi Yaakov Lisa said, Shema is an argument for keeping everything the same and just listening to God. He says, no, it's not. The Gemara says Shema is an argument. The word Shema is an argument. They say Shema in any language. That's precisely what the reformers want. So that's interesting. He's certainly read the book of the Hamburg Bezdin that he's writing back about. But you know, these are people who are very learned, and you have to pay close attention because they know Tanakh clearly, you know, and they know Gemara, and it's the polemics are subtle. Okay, we'll do some more of this halach part of the book, and then maybe I found the other book that's written after this, written pro the Hamburg Bezdin back to him, so we may see that also. That's by somebody else. All right, have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
As well.